Damon Fordham, professor of history at Virginia College in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm here to talk about the great Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who was basically the founder of what was known as Negro History Week, which is today known as Black History Month. It was considered Black History Month by 1976. Dr. Woodson, who is shown here, was born in Virginia back in 1875, and he grew up working in coal mines and the like, but he had a determination to be educated. He eventually went on to Berea College in Berea, Kentucky. Now that's an interesting school because in 1855 it was formed as the only integrated college in the southern states. The University of South Carolina, which was my alma mater, was integrated for a brief period from 1873 to 1877 during Reconstruction, which is another story that I'll tell you later. But Berea remained an integrated school until 1904, the year after Dr. Carter G. Woodson graduated with his degree from that school. And ironically, it reintegrated the year of his death in 1950. Dr. Woodson enjoyed reading the works of George Washington Williams, who was the first African American to write books about black history. And he later came to believe that if the general public knew more about the real contributions of black people as opposed to the propaganda that was spread in those days, that this would lessen racism against blacks on the part of other groups, and it would improve the self-esteem of African Americans, which was something that was greatly needed and still is to a large degree today. He formed the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1916 while he was teaching at Howard University. And he also founded the Journal of Negro History so that people could read and document this important history. Then in 1926 he formed Negro History Week, which in 1976, as I mentioned earlier, became known as Black History Month. Now, the thing about Negro History Week and Black History Month is this. A lot of people believe this ridiculous story that it was formed because it was the coldest and shortest month for black people. No, that is not the case. Dr. Woodson formed it during the second week of February because it was the birth week of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Okay? So, following all of that, it spread throughout the black communities and young children learned about Crispus Attucks and Benjamin Banneker and Phyllis Wheatley and all the rest that are often talked about during this month. And so he also spread his ideas through newspaper articles, including Marcus Garvey's Negro World newspaper, as well as the Pittsburgh Courier and the Baltimore African American and the Chicago Defender, and he compiled his ideas into many books. On a personal note, Dr. Woodson wrote The Story of the Negro around 1922. And while my father was at South Carolina State in the 1940s, his surviving journal records that he read this book. And when I was a child, he would tell me a number of the stories from this book regarding black history. He also wrote the Negro Orators and their Orations, which was at the Charleston's John L. Dark Library. At one time, it was the segregated library in Charleston for black people. Today, it still serves the black community, although anyone can use it. And I read that book when I was younger, and I was amazed at the dazzling use of language among these African-American statesmen and writers at a time when many people thought that the people were completely illiterate. So Dr. Woodson's legacy is important in encouraging this type of thing. Now, especially important now because today, while black history is popular, there's an unfortunate level of quackery that's among a lot of things right now. For example, there's this belief that this white man named Willie Lynch came to Virginia in 1917 and made this very short speech that told the slave owners, all you got to do to keep them slaves is to separate the light from the dark and the old from the young, and they'll be your slaves forever. And a lot of people accept that as gospel, except when you read it, the language is that of the 1900s and not the 1700s. And secondly, the ancestors of today's blacks were not so ignorant that just one guy making a short speech can make them slaves and followers forever. Come on. Anyway, that was exposed as a hoax on April the 6th, 2013. Dr. Kwabena Ashanti, who was of North Carolina Central University, confessed to that newspaper that it was that he made the whole thing up and that unfortunately he fooled a lot of uncritically thinking black people. So much for Willie Lynch. Then there's the story that the first president of the United States before George Washington was a black man named John Henson. Okay, first of all, some bells should ring off to you right there about that. Number one, how could a man be president when the majority of his people are enslaved and they can't vote anyway? Think, people. Anyway, that was exposed as a fraud in the fall 2001 issue of American Legacy, which is an African American history magazine. Now, Dr. Woodson also taught some very important things in his most famous book, Miseducation of the Negro. I'm going to share some of that with you. He mentions that, for example, no people can go forward when the majority of those who should know better have chosen to go backward. But this is exactly what most of our misleaders do. Not being learned in the history of the background of the race, they figure out that there is no hope for the masses, and they decide then that the best thing they can do is to exploit these people for all they can and to use the accommodations selfishly. Such persons have no vision and therefore perish at their own hands. Sound familiar with a lot of the leadership? Not all, but many of it. Now, how about this? There's some people who figure that we should only study, African American history. Well, the problem with that is that sometimes limits your view of how we fit in the world. He said, Dr. Woodson, we do not mean to suggest here, however, that any people should ignore the record of the progress of other races. We would not advocate any such unwise source. We say hold on to the real facts of history as they are, but complete such knowledge by studying also the history of races and nations which have been purposely ignored. We should not underrate the achievements of Mesopotamia, Greek, and Rome, but we should also give equally as much attention to the eternal African kingdoms, the Songhai Empire, Ethiopia, which through Egypt decidedly influenced the civilization of the Mediterranean world. Makes sense? Politics. The Negro should endeavor to be a figure in politics, not a tool for the politicians. The higher role can be played by not parking all the votes of the race on one side of the fence, as both blacks and whites have done in the South, but by independent action. The Negro should not censor the Republican Party for forgetting him, and he should not blame the Democratic Party for opposing him. Neither can the South blame anyone but itself, but it's for its isolation in national politics. Any people who will vote the same way for 3 generations without thereby obtaining results ought to be ignored. Sounds like now, huh? Oh, a couple more. History shows that it does not matter who is in power. Those who have not learned to do for themselves and have to depend solely on others never obtain any more rights and privileges in the end than they had in the beginning. Those are some of the great teachings of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So, on this Black History Month, and in fact, throughout the whole year, I encourage you to go to the libraries and read the works of great people like Dr. Carter G. Woodson, so that people could basically move forward, and so that such ideas will continue in living form. This is Damon Fordham on the great Dr. Carter G. Woodson and how Black History Month came into being.